Hi everyone. So first of all, an apology. I know the sound isn't perfect. I know the quality isn't perfect. This is my smaller laptop. I'm basically using the other one for the data that I'm going to be talking about. But also, it's got less space at the moment, so practical reasons. But hopefully it'll be audible enough. This one is just a bit of post-election analysis. Um, I was shattered yesterday. I'd been up all night, so I was sleeping a good bit of yesterday. I watched the proceedings. I watched Starmer go to the King. He is now our 58th Prime Minister and the 7th Labour Prime Minister after MacDonald, Attlee, Wilson, Callaghan, Blair, and Brown. Um, I think whatever way it's glossed over, it was a very good night for Labour and a disaster for the Tories. An absolute disaster. The worst result they have ever got. I remember when the Sky News, I was watching their live stream when they had the projection. I mean, even with all the talk of a Labour landslide, to see it was quite something. Um, I couldn't help it. I stuck on things can only get better by Dream. Now, disclaimer here: I'm not a massive supporter of the Labour Party, so don't get me wrong, but it's just a good song, and I just felt like it. I think there are differences with 1997, and I'll come to that. Let's just break down the figures because it's important. Firstly, an important factor, there was a low turnout, 60%. In my seat, Sunderland Central, it was a pathetic 52%. If you live in Sunderland and didn't vote, why not? I mean, you know, when you have democracy, you vote for what you get, basically. And if you don't vote, then I wouldn't go so far as saying it should be like mandatory, but if you complain and yet you don't vote, I think you could even vote none of the above. Just do something. I think it's a duty. I do believe that. Um, but anyway, pathetic turnout in some areas. That is a major issue. Voter apathy at 60% is not great. By contrast, in 1997 it was 71%. So, it's not a great turnout. Um, Starmer's party got an incredible 411 seats. The Tories, the Conservative Party under Rishi Sunak, 121 seats. That's appalling. The worst result since the party formed in 1834. It's a dreadful result, whatever way they look at it. And that is even with probably regaining a few reform votes, and I'll come to that in a minute. A very good night for the Liberal Democrats. They got 72 seats, their best result in a century, certainly since David Lloyd George. So that's better than Nick Clegg's result in 2010. Um, let's see. The S&P was decimated. I think 2024 is very much a reverse of 2015. So the S&P went from, let me check the data here. They've lost 39 seats. They're on nine seats. They went down 38. Now in 2015, what happened was we had a sort of Maggie Simpson map of the UK, whereby the Tories done very well in England and the SNP done very well in Scotland. This time it's sort of the reverse. Both the Conservatives and SNP have been hammered, and the parties that lost out that year, Labour and the Lib Dems, particularly the Dems, have totally reversed that. That says something about Ed Davey. Now, I admit I didn't take him very seriously, and all those gimmicks on the trail weren't taken very seriously, but he must have something. The Lib Dems, but very good night for them. So no wonder Mr. Davey looked very happy. Let's see. I don't really follow Northern Ireland politics, but it was a good night for the Nationalists. One problem with the Unionists in Northern Ireland is they're often overtly negative and divided, from what I could tell. Reform UK, let's get to the elephant in the room. Reform UK got 5 seats. It's a lot less than the projection of 13. But I'm going to come to the votes in a minute because that's an important part of our system and why that doesn't read up to the same as seat allocation. The Greens, it has to be said, it was a good night for them, unfortunately. I don't like the Greens, I'm not going to deny that. They're on 4 seats, up from one, so it was a good night for them. They also got Bristol Central from the Labour candidate who would have been in the cabinet. So, Greens are going to pick up from Labour, I think. Like Comru, 4 seats up from two. But yeah, that's basically the main parties. Now, if you look at actual votes, Labour's vote is not that impressive. But again, this might reflect the low turnout. 9.7 million. It's significantly less than the 13.5 million Blair got in 1997, and a lot less than the largest ever vote allocation or popular vote, which was John Major, believe it or not, in 1992, over 14 million votes. That's really surprising. I mean, a lot of people would think, oh, it must be Thatcher 79 or Blair 97. No, it was actually John Major's Conservative Party in 1992 has the largest number of votes ever cast in a British general election, 14 million. That hasn't been replicated since. The Conservatives, this is disastrous, 6.8 million. That's more typical to the sort of vote Liberal Democrats would have got a while back. The Liberal Democrats, 3.5 million votes. Now, this is an interesting thing and controversial thing. Reform, 4.1 million votes, so significantly more than the Liberal Democrats. Yet Reform has 5 MPs, the Liberal Democrats have 72. How's that? Well, first past the post is something that smaller parties have always criticised. Indeed, the Liberal Democrats have long criticised it. But they've said we're going to work with what we've got. There was a referendum on that. I was part of that. In fact, I favoured some sort of reform at the time, at the AV referendum in 2011, because I felt it was fundamentally unfair that the number of votes didn't allocate with the number of seats. But then, since then, I'm not so sure because fundamentally it's a basic choice. You vote, the candidate that gets the most votes wins. That's first past the post. That is, there's no prize for second place. That's how our system works. And it is fundamentally democracy because the most popular candidate in a given seat becomes the MP. Now that's democracy. So no doubt Reform will complain about this and say, well, wait, we got 4 million votes but only 5 seats. But the point about that is they came second in many seats. They didn't come first in many seats. They came second in many seats. It says to me that for all Reform's success, they have failed to fully win people around. And I think the reason for this is obvious. I think there is a toxic side to Reform ranks. I think there is an ugly, racist element within Reform. Now, I'm not saying that Farage and Tice are personally racist, and I know they really stress the point that they put rules in place that anyone who's, former or anyone with far right connections is thrown out, they immediately act on this, etc. The point about this is not, okay, well, we're punishing them when it happens. The point is there is a culture in Reform that frankly attracts some pretty obnoxious people. Now, it's true you're going to get those that you're going to get obnoxious people in Labour ranks as well. You're going to get them in the Conservative ranks. But for a smaller party, it's more highlighted because it's more disproportionate. I think Reform does have an image problem. And some people may disagree with this, but I do think the Russia thing was a factor. I think there will be disillusioned Conservatives who were going to vote Reform. Then they heard Farage's piece on Russia and Ukraine, and not just Farage. There was other candidates like that guy in Malins in Salisbury. I hope he did not win. I haven't checked the Salisbury results, but I do think it put off a lot of people. Um, for me, I've just argued this point on a debate thread. I still am not convinced Reform is a major party. I think it's simply the latest reincarnation of UKIP and the Brexit Party, and I think it's a one-man show. I think it's a Nigel Farage show. He won his Clacton seat, the eighth time he's tried to become an MP. Farage has ability, I'll give him that. He's a character. I actually don't think he's that smart because some of the things he comes out with, I mean, he said that, for example, Andrew Tate is a legitimate voice for men. And that's not very smart when you consider the controversy that follows Andrew Tate. So sometimes Farage shoots himself in the foot. He also, well, that's just my personal opinion. He sucks up to Trump. Um, it's kind of sycophantic, I find, their relationship. It's but yeah, I think it's a one-man show. I think there's a bit of a personality cult around Farage, not dissimilar to Corbyn actually in Labour, or when he was Labour leader. Um, the thing I like about Starmer is actually what was good about Biden, not his age, but the fact there isn't a personality cult around Starmer. That's a good thing. He's the leader, he's now the Prime Minister, but he's respected, he's not loved, he's just, okay, he's a leader and he's the Prime Minister, but there isn't a personality cult, and that's actually a good thing. Um, I would say with Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, and Jeremy Corbyn, they all had a bit of a personality cult, which in my view is not particularly healthy in politics. Rishi Sunak didn't have it either. Um, let's see. I mean, with reform, I still believe it is basically a protest party. I still think that a lot of people vote reform done it because they were disillusioned with the Tories, but they're naturally conservative and so won't vote for Labour. Um, Now, if reform in the next election, whether that be 2028 or 2029, if they gain more seats, then I would say, okay, this is a serious party. But as it stands, I think they've just been lucky last night. I think they were, you know, I do think it's a protest party. I think what will happen is the Conservatives will find some way to be rebuild themselves. They will need to introspect. I think one of the biggest problems they had was the constant infighting, the constant plots. You know, I have to say it's pretty funny to me when Conservatives say, "Oh, Sunak lost because he stabbed Johnson in the back." Well, wait a second. Boris Johnson stabbed Theresa May in the back, and that doesn't really explain why red wall seats have gone back to Labour. I mean, after 2019, the thing is, Johnson got that victory in 2019. It was a weak Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. He got the red wall seat, but all the sleaze came after that that was associated with Boris Johnson. Partygate, the Barnard Castle thing, the betting scandal, all of this tapped into this idea of an arrogance of power. I think Penny Mordaunt recognised that she lost her seat. One of many big name Tories who did. Um, I will say this. I think there will have been decent MPs who actually lost their seat through no fault of their own. It was part of the trend. And yet, even some Conservatives, I don't like the Conservative Party particularly, but I don't think that every MP who lost their seat was a terrible MP. It's just the nature of politics. Politics is rough. And I have to be honest, I did feel somewhat sorry for Sunak when, he was leaving probably his constituency and some heckler shouted out, "Oh, you're a loser." And it just, politics is tough. There is a human side to that. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact two MPs have been murdered in recent years. Um, that's why I thoroughly condemn attacks on anyone. Um, it's tough. I think if the Tories would take this as, "Oh, let's all blame Sunak and say it's entirely Sunak's fault," I think that would be wrong. There's collective responsibility here, and those Tories who attacked Sunak were probably the same people who were plotting against Theresa May. So it became this rotating door of prime ministers, five leaders in 8 years. It's just, we were becoming the laughing stock of the Western world. One good thing that Starmer's proposing is more stability, i.e., less ministerial reshuffles. That's a good thing. Maybe that's more for another video. But what can be said about this election? Yes, it was a victory for Labour, a very comfortable victory for Labour. They have a right to be happy about it. But this shouldn't be seen. Farage, I guess, was right about one thing. It wasn't a major lurch to the left because, yes, Labour done well, the Liberal Democrats done well, the Greens done well, but I'm not sure that a lot of people went to Labour because they're really, keen on woke ideology. I think it was okay. Starmer has shown himself to be a capable leader. He's detoxified Labour's image. I think he has done that. I also think the Tories were a bit desperate in the closing days. I mean, attacking Starmer because he wanted to take some time off on Friday evenings, that's ridiculous. I don't want a robotic prime minister who collapses from exhaustion. I mean, it's ridiculous. So some of the attacks seemed like scraping the barrel. Um, Sunak wasn't a particularly popular prime minister, but then neither was Liz Truss. She lost her seat. Um, I think with the Tories, it was just there's this perception of arrogance of power. um, One rule for them and another for everyone else. I was furious about Partygate, and I remember Johnson supporting, "Oh, it's all exaggerated, it's all taken out of context." No, when the ruling party sets rules and then breaks them, that infuriates people, particularly when the penalties are rigid. One student got a £10,000 fine. Now, if Labour does similar things, if there is rules set over something, probably not like pandemic, but Labour ministers break those rules, Starmer is going to have to be ruthless because otherwise a cultural sleaze will set in. Um, how do I feel about the results? I'm quite happy actually, and I'll explain why. Not because I have any big love for the Labour Party. I do have significant concerns about their identity politics, about issues like free speech, and there's areas like that I think the Tories were right about. But I'm cautiously optimistic. I do think they'll be more compassionate on issues like welfare. Now, I'm under no illusions. Still going to be sanctions. Nothing's going to change overnight. Possibly not even in the next few months. But I do think fundamentally Starmer will take a more compassionate approach to things like that. So the changes will not be massive, but there'll be something. It'll be better than what the Tories have done. Um, so the other reason I'm cautiously optimistic, I'm pleased that SNP was wiped out. I'm a unionist. I don't want to see a nationalist party. The SNP exists for nationalism. Swinney was beating that drum. That's good. I don't want to see a mandate for nationalism, and the SNP keep saying there is a mandate for independence. I'm not convinced that's the case at all. Polls have been quite constant on that, roughly 50-50, and the SNP's never respected the result of the 2014 referendum. Labour is a unionist party. I'm pleased they've done well in Scotland. I'm very pleased Galloway's been kicked out. Now, granted, his Workers' Party it's a small party, but Galloway, I think Neil Kinnock was right in his analysis of George Galloway. He's a totally toxic character. I mean, you could see when Kinnock was interviewed on, I think it was the BBC, his thoughts on Galloway. I think Galloway's toxic. I'm pleased he's been kicked out after 4 months as MP for Rochdale. However, Labour cannot be complacent. The the new MP there will have to listen to the concerns and the anger that brought Galloway in the first place. Galloway's an agitator, a bit like Alex Salmond and his obnoxious Alba party. So anyway, I'm pleased Galloway's been kicked out. Um, I do think it's important to have a strong opposition to hold the government to account. So I actually want the Tories to rebuild a little bit, not because I want them in power, but because a healthy democracy has to have a strong opposition. And despite what Farage says, he's not the opposition. I think he's a protest party. The Liberal Democrats, also a centre-left party, no doubt will have some disagreements with Labour. But the Tories, although they've been decimated, are still technically the opposition. Um, think now that Starmer's party has gotten to power, we might say actually they're not as extreme as people fear. In 1924, there was fears that McDonald's party would be radical far left. It wasn't. It was actually quite responsible, although it didn't last very long, lasted 10 months. But at that time, there was fears that aristocrats were going to get their throats cut in their sleep. Never happened. There's a new book, incidentally, published about McDonald's cabinet called The Wild Men. I'd like to get my hands on it. What else can be said? It was a good night for the Greens, unfortunately. I can't really explain that because just Stop Oil's massively unpopular and the Greens have supported them. I do think there's young people that are quite ideological on this, um, but why not vote Labour? And another thing I don't understand is, why on earth would the Climate Party run against the Greens? Or you get Mickey Mouse parties running against other Mickey Mouse parties? It just doesn't make sense. Um, the Greens are up a bit, but it may well be that the Greens are forced to be more responsible and a bit more mainstream and back away from some of the more outlandish policy areas, i.e., become more like the Continental Greens. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Greens and Reform in the next election. If either of them gain seats, then they'll have to be taken seriously. At the moment, I believe both are protest parties. Um, In the case of the Greens, I'm not so sure what that is. I think there is young people who are genuinely concerned about climate change issues. Maybe they don't think Labour goes far enough. Who knows? Um, but anyway, that's my analysis of this election. In terms of the actual votes, it's not as impressive as what the seat allocation looks like. But I think whatever way it's glossed over, I mean, Labour got 63% of the votes. It was a major victory, whatever way this is glossed over. It was a major, major victory for the Labour Party, the biggest since 1997, and one of the biggest ever. Disaster for the Tories. Um, so I think what Starmer needs to do is certainly not be complacent, and I don't think he is. It's one reason he won. He wasn't being arrogant. He wasn't sort of acting like he was entitled to power. In fact, it's ironic. Up until the last day, it was Sunak that was smiling, and Starmer that looked concerned. Um, I predict. I'll just close with this thought. I will predict that Starmer will be prime minister for about 5 or 6 years, maybe 7 years, but it won't be in as long as Blair because he's a slightly older man, and um, I think there'll be some sort of internal leadership thing. He won't get everything right. No doubt there'll be some sort of internal scandal or something that will trigger a leadership election in about 5 years. I can't see it being as bad as the Tories. I think his party's a bit more united. At least his cabinet is. There's experienced people in the cabinet. Um, Rachel Reeves, I'm not convinced about. She's done that U-turn, which I'm critical of regarding bonuses. David Lamy's experienced, Yvette Cooper's experienced, and I'm always optimistic with new governments. Hell, even in 2010, I thought, okay, maybe the Tories will get some things right, although I had unease at that time, which transpired to be true with the so-called big society and austerity. But I'll say one last thing. Credit to both Sunak and Starmer, they were both very civil in their and gentlemanly in what they said about each other, which American politics can learn from that. Um, I honestly don't think Sunak was necessarily a terrible prime minister. He just had the misfortune of being the fifth Tory prime minister in a row, and so it fell on him. But this idea that, oh, if we kept Boris Johnson, it would all be fine. There was genuine public anger over Johnson's sleaze, and the idea that the public, that resonated with the public. It came after the Red Wall votes in 2019. I'm not convinced were Boris Johnson still leader, maybe Starmer's victory wouldn't be as big, but I think the Tories would still have been defeated.